Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to see you on this Sunday morning, where I am, Sunday afternoon or evening, wherever you are, maybe. Good to see Wanel, South Africa. Good to see you, Anulu. Good to see you, or Analu. So anyways, just before we get started, make sure to do the basic things, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are not already. There's always about half the people who watch who aren't subscribers, so you can do that. It's free. It'll help you keep track of what we're doing. Support us on Patreon if you haven't or want to, or, you can support via YouTube during this conversation as well. Our guest today is once again Abdaljawad Omar. This is the 11th conversation in the Conversations with Abdaljawad Omar series. People like to joke and call Abboud the co-host. Certainly a special guest, a key contributor, a regular contributor. And so Abdaljawad is a writer, analyst, and lecturer based in Ramallah, Palestine. He currently lectures in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University. He has written extensively in Arabic and at this point, really extensively in English as well, contributing to sources like Electronic Intifada, including also their regular live streams. He's contributed to a number of those, Mondoweiss, Ebb Magazine, Material, and other outlets. So anyway, Abboud, good to be with you again. Good to see you today.
Good to see you as well, Jared. I'm happy to be with you again.
Yeah, always good to be with you. So there's a lot that we could go through. I mean, it's been a month since we talked, and I don't think that we were chatting a little bit before, and part of it is that a lot of new things has happened, and still, not a lot has changed necessarily in terms of the overall equations of the genocide, of the war. But there are definitely new things to talk about, and so it's good to have you on also to talk about some of these different things. Before we get into overall questions, is there anything that you kind of wanted to start with in terms of, what you're monitoring or, paying attention to right now that you think is important?
Well, I mean, everybody was waiting. Like there are a lot of events happening here and there. So first, there's the heating up in the northern front, which is interesting to see to the extent that Israel will take what happened in the village in the Syrian Golan Heights, Majd al-Shams, as a excuse justification to widen the scale of war with Lebanon, and to what extent it will actually remain within the confines of the rules that have been established since the beginning of October 7th, which include this kind of war of attrition that escalates, but also does not escalate necessarily on Israeli terms. And I think this is one of the important elements of what has been happening since the beginning of this war, is that Israel has lost this kind of escalation dominance. It's not the only actor that actually can escalate or respond or determine when it will escalate its war efforts or not. So we will see. I mean, I think since yesterday, because Israel has been waiting and assessing its situation, the lack of response in the past 24 hours shows that at least it's measuring its response, and it's not, taking, any escalation with any ease. And I think this says something about, the larger context of this kind of fatigued army, fatigued society, undergoing like a war of attrition that has been damping its economy, that has led to the wide-scale eviction of a lot of its settlements in the north and the south as well. So in many ways, we're in this kind of situation where Israel is always threatening war, but at the same time not really acting on it. and that raises question not only in terms of its deterrence capacity, not in terms of its dominance or ability to escalate or dominate the escalation ladder, but also raises question whether it can actually really fight a war on multi fronts, including within Gaza, or whether it's just buying time to create more facts on the ground in Gaza. And these facts, of course, include the destruction of, the built environment and the daily massacres that have been happening there for the past 10 months or so. And, the changing of the landscape of Gaza, its borders, the conditions on the Philadelphia corridor or the Rafah crossing, including what Israel calls the Netzarim corridor, which cuts Gaza in the middle. So whether it's buying time to do more of the same in Gaza, or whether it's really pushing for this kind of long durée warfare, or whether it doesn't know what to do because of narrow political calculations in terms of the government that is in control in Israel, which includes Netanyahu and his right-wing flank, embodied in people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So when we read this Israeli map, we see on the one hand a divided, fatigued society, a jaded society as well, going with the motions, not being able to mount, enough resistance, wanting a total victory but incapable of having it, and at the same time looking for its own alliance system to actually help pitch in a scenario where you see a more or larger scale war. And I think part of Israel's strategy is to the extent possible to get the Americans and Europeans involved if they're going to go for this kind of wide escalation with Lebanon and with the resistance axis in Yemen and Iran and other places. So, my reading is I don't really sense that there will be a real escalation towards war. Of course, you could have a scenario where things, slowly but steadily reach the level of war without anybody intending to do so. But I don't think that's going to be the case. And the second thing that I'm looking at is that now Netanyahu has larger maneuverability to actually conclude an agreement, a ceasefire agreement. And it stems from the fact of Israel's current political system. The Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, is currently, or I think today maybe, it starts its summer break, which means that it will be tougher for, his right-wing flank, Netanyahu's right-wing flank, to actually, throw him off power, even if he agrees to a ceasefire agreement. He has a bit more maneuverability when it comes to his right-wing fascist flank to conduct an agreement with Hamas, brokered by the US, Egypt, and Qatar, and ensure that at least for the next 2 months that he could stay in power. So there's that opening that creates the conditions for some sort of agreements to come through. There's that opinion that Netanyahu will actually exploit this political moment, this kind of technical break in the Knesset, where bringing a motion of non-confidence in the Israeli government would be difficult, and where the right-wing fascist flank will only have the option of doing so after the break finishes, which I think is in October 27th. They could resign, but he will still be the caretaker government because you cannot really form a government in light of him, agreeing to a ceasefire agreement. So that gives Prime Minister Netanyahu at this point more maneuverability to actually conclude an agreement with Hamas and with the Palestinian resistance, as I said before. So there's that element that is playing out. There's another camp that says, no, that's not going to happen. Netanyahu wants to postpone the war. He wants to wait out the American elections. He will not go for an agreement. He will maintain this kind of war of attrition position and drag it until he gets Trump in power, whereby he will try to maneuver politically and strategically so that Americans would be more willing to actually pitch in terms of their armed forces and their position in a direct engagement with Iran or with Hezbollah or with all of the resistance axis overall. So there's that opinion that Netanyahu will just wait until the American political system produces a new presidency, and he's betting that Trump will come to power, and that will serve his interest of staying in power, but at the same time, this kind of strategic goal that Israel has, which is to not fight the wars it's fighting alone, for a lot of reasons. Among them, that it needs actually direct military support, not only coming to its military, but actually direct military intervention by Western forces, and most importantly, of course, in this is American forces. So I think there's these two camps. I'm not sure what will unfold, but I'm leaning more towards the fact that we'll probably see some sort of agreement coming through in the next month or so. But with every conjuncture like that, we should qualify it that it's just a prediction that you could after a month say nothing of that happened. But I do think that there are a lot of forces, whether it's the Israeli military, whether it's its security network, whether it's the fatigue in the army, whether the need to regroup and redirect its efforts and war efforts, whether it's the loss of tanks and armored vehicles, and also personnel throughout the past 10 months, the economic dampening of Israeli economy, a lot of the social factors of also returning the Israelis that were evicted from the north and the south back, that there's that need for an end to the war and the status of war, at least for a while, before Israel can regroup and think of its own strategic objectives, including, of course, returning the Israeli captives that are held by the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip. So I think that there's a lot of internal factors that are pushing for an agreement. And now Netanyahu perhaps have more maneuverability politically within his own coalition to perhaps conclude an agreement. But I don't want to be too hopeful or give people too much hope, because I think that's also there's also a good case to be made that Netanyahu does not want an agreement and he will drag it out until Trump comes to power. But I do think it's risky because, first of all, Trump might not come to power, first of all. And then you'll get a Democratic president, maybe Harris or somebody else, who is now more sensitive also or to the changing attitudes of Americans on the issue of Palestine and on the conduct of Israel in this war more broadly. And that will cause more headache, but also that America will be engaged in its own internal conflict, because if we get a Democratic president, in most likely scenario, the idea that Trump will allow that to unfold without at least some sort of internal I wouldn't say necessarily civil war, but at least internal fissures rising and heating up across the dividing line in the United States would also mean that America will be busy with its own internal problems rather than actually looking outwards towards the world, or have any taste for any kind of like conflict in the Middle East or elsewhere within this type of internal fissure and conflict. So it's a risky move to drag it out, and I don't think necessarily Trump will be any radically different, of course, from any Democratic president, but it's still a risky move by Netanyahu to drag this out, or reliance on a more hospitable or more amenable American administration that would back Israel, including backing it up in terms of its strategic goal of perhaps widening the conflict towards Iran and towards the developments in the nuclear program in Iran as well. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah.
It makes sense. Yeah. I mean, we can talk more, I think, about the American side maybe a little bit later in the conversation, because I think there's some, I mean, I know you would acknowledge this, but there's other possible ways that it could go. And, I think it's interesting the kind of this sort of limbo state things are in right now in the US, because Biden is in power, but he's not running. Harris is not yet in power, but she is running. And obviously Trump is what Trump is, but there's like, so yeah, I mean, we could talk more about that, but that is interesting because I think is one way to read that you could say, well, Netanyahu could seize control of the disunity, of the lack of certainty, to not feel very accountable right now in this moment, knowing that Biden's going to probably continue to supply him weapons for the next 6 months. And but I do think one thing that you said I totally agree with, which is I don't think that the United States has much appetite for direct involvement in any war right now. And if it did, I think it would be more thinking about that in terms of like China or something like that. And I think that's down the road. Like, I just don't think, I mean, we talked early in some of the early conversations about how, Israeli soldiers were not used to having to engage in direct combat, right? They're snipers, they're drone operators, etc. I think that's even more the case for US troops at this point. I mean, obviously there were the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's been a long time since a heavy deployment of US troops engaged in, serious combat situations. And I mean, obviously they could send in a lot of F-16s, they could send in a lot of drones, they could engage in that way that they have, under Obama, say. But yeah, I don't know their appetite. I don't imagine that their appetite currently is one that wants to escalate, to bring in other fronts and become directly involved in those fronts. Maybe Iran is something that they think about, but I think the United States is fairly uh, afraid, actually, of some of the capacity of what Iran could do in a bigger war if they directly attacked it. So anyway, that's an interesting discussion, and we can talk more about that. I do want to get to, though, something that people had questions about, I had questions about, which is this Beijing Declaration, this meeting that happened. Hamas was part of it, Fatah was a part of it. I don't know, because it wasn't widely reported, whether other factions, Palestinian parties of factions, were a part of it, or if it was really more those two. I know there was this kind of declaration of national unity that seems to be a kind of future declaration, meaning, intent for down the road of a government that composed both Gaza and the West Bank as a kind of unity government. And so I think on one level, people were looking at this and saying, "Oh, this is a big deal." On another level, it seemed like it falls in line of some past agreements that have sort of happened in principle, but then not really carried out to a lot in action. But I was curious how you're analyzing that, and if you think there's much significance to it at this point.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think it's significant at all when it comes to intra-Palestinian politics. I think that, Palestinians were simply embarrassed not to go to Beijing, and because the Chinese, and I think this is what it's important about this story, is that the Chinese are trying to create this contrast with America on the global stage, that they're willing to engage more constructively with, Palestinian intra-politics, and instead of fostering this unity between Palestinians, that they want to actually foster unity, and signaling their role, as a global power that, wants to engage, as a rising and global power that wants to engage more diplomatically, constructively, specifically with global South countries and peoples, including the Palestinians. And I think that the Palestinian intrapolitical, reality, just, people were, the political factions were embarrassed not to actually engage. This is maybe the 17th agreement that we had, that is all, gone, unheeded, unexecuted. And I think the reasons for that, as I enumerated quite a lot, that the conditions of this unity is not just a political disagreement. You have two different political formations that have two different alliance systems, that have two different solutions of what Palestinians should do, One is, based on this kind of politics again of cooperation, accommodation with Israel, and collaboration embodied in the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The other is based on this alliance with, regional forces like Iran, Hezbollah, and others, and attempting, a politics of defiance and resistance, as we saw since October 7th, and that these two type of political projects cannot really necessarily meet unless one of them turns towards the other, meaning that, either Hamas, for instance, as the biggest, driving force behind now resistance as an idea and practice, is willing to engage in this kind of politics and accommodation and collaboration, or if there's a change or a radical shift in the current PA and Fatah leadership towards a more confrontational, defiant form of policy. And I don't see that happening. I see actually, more of an entrenchment behind these different positions that each political formation has been taken, whether it's defiance or cooperation. Therefore, I think that the Palestinian political scene, and political parties and the leaders were just embarrassed not to engage with this and come out with something constructive in front of the Chinese rather than anything that is serious. However, having said that, the current situation and the talks around the ceasefire agreement, we don't know much of the details of what could actually transpire in this kind of day after scenario. So, and I think the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip is, looking for some sort of arrangement where it perhaps, maybe it's not looking for, but maybe it's also compromising. We don't know it necessarily, whereby some political force or some form of security arrangement can be, implanted in the Gaza Strip that will actually bring maybe a more, faces or political formations close to the PA line, at least on some level in the Gaza Strip, so that they would be the ones responsible for the rebuilding of Gaza, will take over responsibility for civil matters, and perhaps the resistance will maintain its presence and, a project, but coexisting with this type of governance burden being placed on someone else. And it doesn't necessarily mean Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. It could mean, forces like Mohammed Dahlan, who lives in Emirates, who's also a Fatah member, but had a disagreement with Abbas and was kicked out of Fatah, but remains a strong actor, specifically having some base of support also in the Gaza Strip itself, or some sort of regional arrangement that includes the Emirates. I mean, we've seen in the past month also the Emirates signaling, and that's not by coincidence, that it's willing to actually place some forces in the Gaza Strip. So there is some movement around this type of Arab force, Palestinian indigenous force, some governance apparatus that actually would see Hamas abdicating civil and governmental powers to somebody else. But we don't know the extent of this type of arrangement and with whom. And maybe it's also a form of play that Hamas is playing within the fissures, within Fatah itself, across the divide between Mohammed Dahlan and Mahmoud Abbas, and their own type of patronage networks that also exist in the Gaza Strip and have their own conflicts or inner conflicts, or if it's if some sort of agreement is coming through around Hamas abdicating governance power on some level, to permit some sort of Israeli talking line that would say that they came out victorious, but also would actually, be a reasonable achievement or accomplishment from Hamas's perspective, because it would not be now held responsible for the aftermath of October 7th and the rebuild of Gaza. Because as this war concludes, if it concludes, of course, but as this war concludes, one of the biggest struggles will be not only the one that we had for the past 10 months, but the one of, what type of social and economic and forms of buildup of Gaza will happen, because I think that's actually an even more important struggle than the struggle that has been happening in the past 10 months, and a more important war, because what Israel has been able to accomplish in this war through the destruction is the amenability of the population of Gaza to think of immigration as a solution to their life condition at this as particular stage. And maybe that would not happen because Egypt will, maintain this kind of enclosed borders. But if we have a humanitarian crisis that persists across, years to come, that will only lead to the slow erosion of the social and political and economic fabric of Gaza itself. So there's a big struggle that we should also account for in the global solidarity movement, because there's an important role for everybody to play in this as well. But I think that's one of the elements and the key components of what would it mean for a day after, even if we assume that Israel will actually withdraw from the Gaza Strip and will not continue the war after any agreement. I mean, that's also a contingent, issue that we might see still Israel maintaining its presence, not allowing, certain areas to be rebuilt, not allowing building materials to come in, choking Gaza on the long term. So it would create the condition for, its ethnic cleansing after, the catastrophe of the total annihilation of the infrastructure. And of course, the massacres of people have been, completed. And of course, the massacres, they change society as well. They change the dynamics of society as well. They empower specific groups within society and also weaken others. And also that, it depends. That's part of the humanitarian management. It depends how you let in, for example, aid to enter Gaza. Now, what we're seeing in Gaza is that aid is coming through like a lot of, forms of, gangs that are, now operating more in the daylight in the Gaza Strip, distributing some of the aid or actually selling the aid or taking over the aid. So, this is creating a social and economic a problem that could erode as well the ability of people to stand steadfast and remain in Gaza and rebuild the life in Gaza. And now I'm speaking about the worst type of scenario. It doesn't mean that it will actually unfold, but there are indications that that's a problem that everybody has to deal with. And I think that also the Palestinian resistance is looking for a way that situation can be solved and resolved in a way that would permit a dignified life for the people in Gaza. And if that means that they have to give up certain specific powers, but still maintain their resistance project intact, that I think they're willing to play within this kind of space. So allowing forces that are more amenable to Israel, more accommodative of Israel to actually have a role in this post October 7th Gaza rebuild. So that is the only thing that I see that is possible, that is coming through these talks, whether it's the PA in the West Bank, whether it's this American push to reconstruct the PA in the West Bank so it's a more legitimate and more amenable, whether it's figures that can bridge the divide between Hamas and Fatah or be acceptable to both. Whether it's a technocratic form of government or whether it's a form of governance that is based on the political power, for instance, of somebody like Mohammed Dahlan in the Gaza Strip, that remains to be seen. I'm sorry, my mic just dropped. So
That's a mic drop. Right on. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I mean, so going back to something you said that the support of the rebuild of the social, political, civilian life, that is something that the international solidarity movement also could play a role in, or say a little bit more about what you mean by that potentially.
Well, it could be in terms of direct, of course, help. I mean, that's different, that's one level of it. But I think the second level is to pressure a lot of the humanitarian actors who have their own political agendas, and of course have their own, and they're driven by government's agendas as well, to meet, people's power, that, at least pushes them in a direction that is more amenable to the interests of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. So there has to be this kind of politics around, problematizing these humanitarian actors, problematizing their work and the nature of their work, but also not only in the form of critique, but also building policies that work for the Palestinian people in a way that, maintains the steadfastness of the people in Gaza and ends this kind of humanitarian catastrophe and permits the work of rebuilding Gaza. Now, look, I'm not the gloomy one. I have a lot of belief, and this is a form of belief in the power of the Palestinian people to regenerate themselves, even after major catastrophes like this. And I never underestimate that ability. But at the same time, Gaza will need a lot of support coming from different directions, including the pressure on humanitarian groups and their work, that I think sometimes operates in line with American foreign policy agenda, with an Israeli agenda, with European agenda, and not with the Palestinian agenda. And I think that is something that we should at least take into consideration in the global movement that supports Palestine.
Understood. Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I did want to get to, right, and I wrote this question out before yesterday, before the action, maybe we'll go there next, actually, so that then we can move on. You said a little bit about it already. Obviously, there was this, depending on who you believe, right? So Hezbollah has denied that they were at all involved in this explosion that killed, I think, 12 people, children, like it was on a play yard or something like that in Golan Heights. I think it's important to contextualize it a little bit too, because obviously, and you could speak to this, Golan is an occupied, territory. Again, I mean, it's all occupied territory, but it's, as of 67, and this is a Druze community from my understanding. And I saw something today that Smotrich tried to attend the funeral today and was actually chased out by the people, saying they didn't want him there. And so obviously Israel's initial response is to blame Hezbollah and say that they did this and that it's this war crime and that they need to escalate and respond. You've talked about some of the things that well, let's just say a little bit about that. So before I started this, one of my questions was kind of it seemed like the Northern Front was approaching a kind of stalemate to some degree, and maybe that's a good way to describe it, since October 8th, where there's been tit for tat. There's definitely been Hezbollah kind of moving up the ladder of escalation, but in a very sensible, moderated approach, where they're not crossing significant thresholds of escalation towards war. And the Zionist entity Israel doing something in that line. I mean, certainly they've had attacks on civilians, and things like that since the war, but it's been not, to think of, I think Al-Mossad said, it's not high, it's not high intensity warfare. It's not, really medium. It's low, but approaching towards medium, which is still obviously, I don't mean to diminish that at all for people who are living, in those conditions and, being bombed and hearing drones and, sonic booms and things like that over their heads, all the time. So do you think that this incident, what are you monitoring with that incident? You said a little bit about it. Is there anything more that you want to say in terms of the front with Hezbollah?
I mean, look, I think the front with Hezbollah is part of this kind of, again, unity of fields that we have spoken about from the beginning. Like the idea of attempting to link various areas of struggle together. Israel's interest in this is the following: it needs to break this unity of fields to be able to to isolate Gaza from Yemen, from Iraq, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iran, and ensure that it can operate in Gaza without paying a hefty price in other areas, or maintaining the pressure from other fields at bay. Now, at the same time, Israel still has deterrence capacity because it still has air superiority and the ability to inflict a lot of damage and harm. And these actors are attempting, at the one hand, to ensure that they pressure Israel, creating the conditions for a war of attrition, and at the same time deter it from actually widening the war. I mean, that's the operative theory of Hezbollah and its engagement in Lebanon, thus across the northern borders thus far. So it didn't make sense at all that Hezbollah would in any way target Majd al-Shams. First of all, it's an Arab community. It's the Golan is part of Syria, occupied in 1967. The people of the Golan Heights are mostly the remaining ones are mostly from the Druze community, who have also a wide presence in Lebanon. So that would alienate another part of the sectarian, let's say, makeup of Lebanon. And the Druze in Lebanon and their leaders, at least within this kind of sectarian makeup, have been quite amenable in backing Hezbollah's war efforts in the south. So not on the sectarian grounds, not on this, nationalist grounds. And also these communities are not in any way, involved in the Israeli military in the way, for instance, the Palestine Druze community has, engaged in since 1948, dotted in the Galilee. A lot of, the Druze community within Palestine decided, in the 50s to accept this kind of recruitment into Israeli military and becoming more of the Israeli state and makeup. And it has its own history and its own historical reasons why they went for this type of decision at some point or another. But beyond that, this community is quite different. It only holds residency permit in Israel. They're not citizens officially, although some are, slowly garnering Israeli citizenship or turning their residency to citizenship. So there's also a quiet social war happening on that within the Golan Heights. But beyond that, I mean, it wouldn't make sense that Majd al-Shams would be a target of a Hezbollah rocket. Now, it could be a misfire, but Hezbollah denied it, even if it's denied that it's a misfire. And the story of what really occurred or happened is not necessarily clear in terms of what truly unfolded in Majd al-Shams. But of course, there've been a lot of kids killed, and it was painful, and there's a multitude of reactions towards that. Now, the timing also comes in this moment. It comes in this moment where you have the Knesset break coming in, the pressure to conclude an agreement, heightening up after Netanyahu's visit to the United States and his return. And at the same time, the choice that Israel has been contemplating since the beginning of the summer, and they have been postponing all the time, this idea that we should conclude or start or initiate a campaign in Lebanon, either a medium intense campaign that would not actually reach the level of open warfare, or going for an open warfare that would decouple Lebanon's front from the Gaza front. At least it will achieve that politically, or you'll reach a war where it has its own dynamics, its own logic, and then we don't know what will happen, because if it becomes an open form of warfare, then anything is also on the table including what weapons will be used, what type of destruction we'll see happening, whether in Lebanon and also in Israel itself. So I think that this is a moment where Israel is tested yet again, and I think they're still thinking within a measured response. They're still thinking of a way to bank on this more in terms of the PR value of what happened or occurred in Majlis Shams than actually engaging in direct large-scale confrontation. It doesn't mean that we won't see a harsh response, but I do still think that it will be within the domain of what Hezbollah can actually accept without escalating to the extent that we will see an open form of warfare. But of course, again, these type of predictions are always they could be wrong. But I think, again, as I said in the beginning of the conversation, Israel is tired, the military is fatigued, and for the past 10 months Hezbollah has been accumulating tactical successes. It has been showing Israel that it can infiltrate its a multi-layered system of air defenses that it has placed across the past 20 years, including its Iron Dome batteries, its radar systems, and it can reach deep within its own territory, have precise targeting of important strategic facilities, and have also the capacity for massive forms of destruction befalling Israeli major urban centers, strategic sites, key civilian infrastructure, but also military infrastructure, including its own air bases and the use of its air power. So there's a lot on stake in terms of what form of escalation is possible without going. And I think that kind of tactical exchange between Israel and Hezbollah is very delicate. Israel has been successful in targeting a lot of Hezbollah operatives or commanders and assassinating some of its important commanders in the south. And these tactical message are the important gist of this attritional war that is happening across the border. But what we've seen also in the past 10 months is the end of Israel's dominance of the air, which is an important feat of the resistance, a project that has been launched at least 30 years ago, or 20 years ago to be more precise, and now is reaching a level that is actually impactful in the battlefield. The use of drones, the use of surveillance, the use of a multitude and ranges of drones that have been an important and key component of Hezbollah's capacities and capabilities in this attritional warfare that is unfolding in the north. And that's, I think, an important element also of how resistance created this new technology, banked on existing technology, adapted it, or reused Israeli technology through reverse engineering, and then ended up with its own form of air force. I mean, of course, it's not as developed as the American Air Force or Israeli Air Force that is heavily reliant on American technology as well. But at least you ended the dominance of Israel in the air, and you're producing your own capacities and capabilities, and you're revealing them in the battlefield in a way that shows your capability of infiltrating the air defenses system that exists across the north, and showing the Israelis what you could do. I mean, you don't necessarily need to do something, but what it does, it shows the Israelis that if you go for war, this will be costly. You won't get away with it. You will pay a heavy price economically. You'll pay a heavy price strategically, and you might even lose the war. You might even lose the war on multi levels, and that's why I think Israel is also deterred from launching a wide-scale war and is incapable of decoupling Lebanon or other areas from the Gaza field, which empowers, of course, the Palestinian resistance in negotiations, and ensures that you have an Israel that either accepts a dampening economy, and the evacuation of a multitude of settlements in the north, that accepts this kind of war of attrition happening across a long time. And I think these type of economic and social forces, like what I was saying about Gaza, have a accumulative role in forcing in making people think maybe I should immigrate within Israel, in making people think that there's no future here, that the state cannot protect me, in eroding the trust between society and military, between the military and the political, and the political class. So that these level or let's say circles of trust that exist also within Israeli society are weakening and eroding in a way that already, was the result of October 7th itself. But as the war stretches itself and, you accumulate, this kind of attritional, or you accumulate a lot of losses economically, socially, on the military front, injuries, in terms of the armored vehicles and tanks, and as you also see that your country is incapable of actually meeting the expectations that you place on its power, that will only feed into inner struggles within Israel, and more disunity within Israel, and the realization that they're not invincible, or they're not capable of everything, and whatever they want to do, that there's another force in the region that can harm them and that can significantly cost them, and that they have to live with that fact, and that they have to start thinking about what it means for their own future in the region overall. So I think that's the elements that are important to look at. So that's why I don't, that's when people say that Israel is wanting to go to war. I don't see it. And now there's another reading. It's a more psychological reading, and it says Israel is on a death drive. It does not care, and it will launch a war even if it costs it much. And I'm not sure. I don't think that that's the case. Israel is more vulnerable than we think because of its condensed demography, because of its condensed urban spaces. It's incapable of, facing, hundreds of thousands of rockets and drones being launched at it, and the potential for even, a military or a limited invasion of its territory, and fighting, face-to-face battle and losing thousands of soldiers and also key nodes in civilian infrastructure, its electricity grid, its system, so there's this kind of doomsday scenario that I don't think that the Israelis are willing to go for. But who knows? I mean, I could look like a fool in a month or so. So, but that's my thinking. I think that they will use it for propaganda bases. They will use it to galvanize support for Lebanon. They will use it to deter Hezbollah and to create more fissures within Lebanon itself around what Hezbollah is doing in Lebanon, which is part of the Israeli strategy, is to get its own historical allies in Lebanon among the right-wing phalange or the right-wing elements within some of the Christian community in Lebanon or other parts of Lebanon, to make its argument in case for the Lebanese people that Hezbollah should stop its attritional warfare across the border. And maybe it will engage in a larger or a larger scale or intensifies the campaign that it does or conducts, but in a measured way that enables it to also or enables Hezbollah to not be pressured into a wider conflict on confrontation with Israel itself. So I mean, I think that's a reality. I don't think anything significant changed. Now, what for people who are watching Israeli news, they're kind of they're looking at a lot of the military analysts, they're looking at a lot of the Israeli military analysts, and everybody is in cahoots and in cohorts saying that we need a war in Lebanon, and there's this kind of concerted effort by a lot of the military analysts to say, war and war now, and it meets, and that kind of environment perhaps indicates that there's kind of a pressure to actually widen the war or make it or escalate it. But again, I think that's not an easy feat for Israel to actually jump to or do in a way that is seamless and without a lot of resistance from within the own military for such escalation that could lead to actually an open warfare, and without thinking seriously about the implications of that on Israel's future in the region itself. So I think Israel remains in a bind. maybe it will escalate to show some sort of willingness to engage in a wider conflict, to intensify it, to tell or send a message to the region that is not afraid of war. But I still doubt it. I'm still unsure that Israel has the capacity at this particular moment in history to engage with in an open warfare with Lebanon, or even in a highly intense campaign in Lebanon that could actually also lead to the erosion again of the circles of trust in Israel, military society, and the military and the political class as well, which will create the conditions for an internal implosion that we have already been seeing some signs of, but will only accelerate in the future if Israel at the end is not successful in any of its fronts. And I think the Israelis are coming slowly to the idea that their military cannot do everything for them. It cannot actually achieve anything objectively except these forms of innovative strategies that have another consequences on its international legitimacy, on its status diplomatically, on its leadership, and the ability to arrest them through ICC, to the International Criminal Court. So that innovative strategy also has repercussions on how people view Israel, even the layman, not people necessarily engaged in Palestinian politics, or have a concrete understanding of the history here. So again, I think that the situation remains that Israel is in this kind of strategic bind, waiting it out, showing its will to continue on the one hand, and incur losses on the other hand, and at the same time incapable of truly rising to the challenge of a multi-front war as it claimed for the past decade or so, because its entire military was supposed to be a military that would be able to fight a war in Lebanon, fight a war in Gaza, fight a war in the region more broadly on 3-4 fronts at the same time. And what this war has proved, it really cannot fight a war in the sense that it actually sold to itself and to its own people and to its allies as well. And that's what's important as well, that Israel's military standing is lessening in the eyes of Saudi leaders and Emirati leaders, and a lot of also the comprador classes in the Arab world. They're seeing it that Israel cannot really necessarily shift the strategic terrain in a way that is amenable or in a way that actually serves to contain the Iranian resistance axis that exists, across Hezbollah, Hamas. That it's not really as competent as it looks, and I think that's one of the long-term also consequences of what happened October 7th and afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. I want to talk about Yemen a little bit, because obviously I think it was a suicide drone, right? The strike that hit Tel Aviv, was a big, this was a big event. I don't know, a week or two ago. Time doesn't mean anything anymore. But then of course there was this response by Israel to basically blow up a bunch of oil tanks, basically, oil refinery or port with oil tanks. And we haven't yet seen a significant response from Ansar Allah, but they've said it's coming, and I think that there will be a response. Initially, this seemed to me like it had the potential to be a very significant flashpoint, um, just because of how dedicated. I mean, it's amazing what Yemen has done in terms of being under its own, really quite genocidal war as well for the last 10 years, from the US through Saudi proxies and, incredible, sanctions, bombing, lots of they've 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 survived a lot, and they continue to be, again, quite steadfast in their support front now for Palestinians too, just in terms of maintaining the blockade, which recently I saw a that, I guess it's Eliat, right? The port that has basically, I think, declared bankruptcy at this point, but it certainly has had an impact on the Israeli economy on the whole, and certainly their ability to get shipments in through that port, which is a significant one. Um, so yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about it over the months, but we haven't talked about that front as much. Yeah, what is your sense there? How has that kind of been received, where you are, in terms of that exchange, right, between Yemen attacking, getting successful in terms of that strike in Tel Aviv, and then, of course, the response.
Well, I mean, Yemen has the most popular, among Palestinians, it's the most popular actor engaging in, backing the Palestinians. First of all, because Yemen is a bit distant from us. When you're closer to somebody, there's always more animosity around, Jordanians or Lebanese or Syrians. So there's that kind of chauvinism that exists between, across the different countries and peoples that exist. So when somebody's more distant, it's easier. But the second level of it, I think that I mean, the past 10 years, also after the Arab revolts that happened in 2011, a lot of Palestinians, of course, had criticism against Hezbollah's role in Syria and the backing of Bashar al-Assad. Yemen, on the other hand, was not a heated topic, or a topic that created fissure among different political ideologies and ways of looking at what really unfolded in Syria and interpreting the events that occurred there. So there is that kind of wide popular support among Palestinians for Yemenis, perhaps more than any other actor engaged. Of course, after this current round with Israel, and of course with the role of Hezbollah, that's also shifting. I mean, there's less criticism of Hezbollah or the resistance axis more broadly, less sectarianism coming through in Arab political discourse, but also in Palestinian political discourse internally. So, things are changing on that level as well. But Yemen has that kind of wide popular support. But I think what is central about what happened is that, again, a very important tactical message, by the Yemeni. I mean, the Yemenis were able to hit the heart of Tel Aviv through a drone that was sent from Yemen, and that reached its target without being intercepted or even, being at the radar in the radar of Israeli air defense. So we don't exactly necessarily know what occurred or happened so that the Yemenis were successful, what tactic that they used. The Israelis are very they have taken a posture since the beginning of this war of lessening the psychological impact of any action by any resistance group. So in many ways, we saw that more clearly in the Iranian strike in April. They're trying as much as possible to frame any event of penetration of their air defenses, of actions against their forces in the Gaza Strip, of successes by the resistance in Lebanon. They attempt as much as possible in relation to their own society, in their relation to their alliance and friends, but also in relation to their enemies, to make any action or any form of tactical success by the resistance as nothing. It didn't really impact us. We have everything under control, etc. However, I mean, this is a large scale tactical success. I mean, it shows that you're vulnerable. It showed Israel that it's vulnerable. Its air defenses will not help it that much in a war with resistance forces that maybe the resistance axis have capacities or capabilities that could evade the radar systems that exist in the region and beyond. Maybe that they're using their drones in a tactical way that could actually evade detection and reach its targets in an unanticipated manner. I mean, of course, after each event like that, the Israelis will be studying what happened. Of course, the other parts of the resistance axis will also look at what happened and occurred. And in response, Israel also tried to assert some sort of message for the entire resistance axis overall by hitting the Hadid port in Yemen. So what they're trying to tell the Iranians specifically is that we have the capacity as an air force to reach thousands of miles away and hit directly a target if we want to, which is a message to its own nuclear program and the ability of Israel perhaps or the capacity of Israel perhaps to reach the targets deep within Iran if it chooses to do so. At least that's how the Israelis attempted to frame also the attack against Yemen, that they will attack in an asymmetric fashion. So they hit a civilian target, they hit it with a lot of missiles, and they destroyed a significant portion of the port. And so they maintain this kind of asymmetric approach. If you hit us, we hit you harder. But at the same time, that they're we can show you also what we have in terms of our capabilities and capacities, and the capacity of Air Force to actually reach and hit far away from its own geography. Now, a lot of people also have claimed, and again, I'm not sure, because I'm always careful with these things, because if you want to build analysis, you have to build them on actual facts. But a lot of people have also doubted if Israel was the one that actually committed or conducted the Air Force attacks against Yemen, or at least that it was provided with support by a lot of regional actors or the American forces through refueling capacities, etc., which Israel doesn't necessarily have. So that it wasn't really necessarily an Israeli accomplishment, at least in a very independent fashion, as it tried to show. Having said that, I mean, I think that the Yemeni impact is largely on the sea traffic and the traffic of ships, cargo ships going from East Asia, Southeast Asia towards Israel, and the companies that work with Israel or are operated by Israeli business owners that have been hit hard by the Yemeni semi-blockade on the Red Sea, and has impacted a lot of international traffic coming through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, and ending up in Israel, or coming through the Red Sea and ending up in the Eilat port. And as you correctly said, the Eilat port itself has declared bankruptcy, which is showing you that there is a huge economic cost associated with shipping costs rising, with the pressure it will have on prices within Israel as well, but also at the same time the cost that it's having on the Suez Canal running and functioning, which is also pressuring indirectly Egypt throughout this conflict. Of course, Egypt has positioned itself in a place to be a mediator in this war between the resistance in Gaza and between Israel, but at the same time the Suez Canal's functioning has been lessened throughout this war, and it was slightly compensated by an influx of money coming from international financial institutions, so the World Bank and the IMF. But it's still they're in a position where the war is hampering the returns that it gets and the revenues it gets from the Suez Canal. So there's an impact also on one of the key, let's say, allies of Israel, embodied in the Egyptian military and its rule and its control of the revenues that come through the Suez Canal. So I think that's an important element as well in terms of the calculation of also close allies. In Netanyahu's speech, he talked about the Arab allies, of these Arab allies that are looking at this and saying that Israel is also costing us a lot of money, revenues, and again, it's incompetent militarily. It's incapable of really solving, the rising tide of the resistance axis and this formation that has been developing itself for the past 30 years or so, since 1978 at least, driven by the Iranian Revolution, and by domestic factors, whether in Lebanon, Yemen, or Palestine, because it wasn't only driven or created by the Iranians themselves. It's created by indigenous factors within Palestine itself, within Lebanon itself, within Yemen itself as well, and incapable of also or hurting our economic interests, destroying the semblance of legitimacy we have with our own population. So it's weakening us. That Israel does not necessarily mean strengthening these regimes or protecting them against, being a balancing act against Iranian power, etc. It's also a burden on these regimes, a burden on the political class and the ruling class of these regimes. And I think that that's slowly also sinking in the minds and cognizance of a lot of the leaders in the Arab world. It doesn't mean that they will, back away from the alliance system that they have created, but I think that they will look at Israel very differently than they looked at it before October 7th. And that's also been transpiring, that, as a result. So the Yemenis are also serving that. They're serving that. They're serving this rising, let's say, cognition among many in the Arab world, but also among, I think, the political ruling class within the Arab world that is in cahoots with Israel and the U.S. and lives under this kind of Pax Americana in the region more broadly. And I think one of the other elements that I would speak to Yemen is that Yemen have devised a new way to conduct, sea blockades that we haven't seen necessarily historically, which will remain an important factor in the tactical and military developments, or one of the tactical and military developments that is more important throughout since October 7th. It's one of, I think it's one of the it's one of the, most important tactical developments in this war, because without necessarily a large navy, without necessarily having a large sea power in of itself, it's capable through various forms of the use of tactics, intelligence, drones, cheap weapons, and also missiles to impose a highly selective form of blockade that targets Israel and companies that work with Israel. So I think that's also another important element in the arsenal of resistances in the region, those seeking to end Western hegemony in the region, but also one that I think the Americans, those who run and manage the empire, if you want, and including the military aspects of the empire, are looking at with a lot of amazement, and they have no concrete solutions to it. I mean, even the Americans and the British had to declare that there's nothing really that we can do, that all we can do is just accept this kind of attritional warfare, and it's happening, and to test it every once in a while by allowing some ships that actually are going to Israel to pass and see what will happen. And still, the Yemenis are attempting to the extent possible to make sure that, these ships do not pass without at least a cost, or being targeted, or being advised to not pass through the Bab el-Mandeb area. So I think that's an important element of what the Yemeni front has been able to do. It's adding to the pressure, adding to the economic toll, creating the fissures, if you want, or creating conditions where regional players in alliance with Israel are also looking at this and seeing it as more of a burden on their own countries and economies and revenue. And I think that that's an important element to the unfolding, Yemeni front and how it's been conducting itself. And now also with this tactical success that we saw targeting the heart of the Roshdan area, the Tel Aviv area, through this drone that it called Yafa, which has also this symbolic resonance because Tel Aviv is the settlement that ate up Jaffa, which was the Palestinian city, a beautiful city on the sea. It ate it up and destroyed it. And now Jaffa is returning in the figure of a drone in the heart of Tel Aviv.
Yeah, no, I appreciated that too. And I just wanted to share something that is kind of funny that is based off of what you just said. So in March and maybe even in February, but they definitely reached out again in March. We get all of these emails from random um, PR firms, basically, right, that are trying to get book guests on our podcasts. And these people don't have sophisticated at all understandings of what we do on our podcast. And so they tried to book a naval defense officer with us in March. And the reason that they tried to book this guy, Gene Morgan, um, was because, um, in large part of he wanted to discuss the United States' intensified maritime operations in the Eastern Mediterranean, the rising tensions with the Houthis in Yemen, and how our increasing involvement in foreign wars impacts national security and the economy. Um, so I have no idea of, we don't bring folks like that on the show, and I have no idea of what his take was on all of it, but it just underscores what you're talking about the level of concern that the United States has in terms of its military experts and so on, of what Yemen is now capable of doing, and the threats of which other people who have talked about logistical capitalism and things like this, like I'm thinking of like Charmaine Chua and others, but um, I think Leila Khalili also has a book that talks about this too, is the sinews of trade, something like that. Um, is that there are these really important choke points in the shipment of goods around the globe that are at a point where resistance forces can make an impact in these areas that has a large economic impact. And as we know, the economy is a very important you know lever, I guess you could say, leverage point of different struggles. And so I think it is very significant. There were some people along the way who I saw trying to diminish the impact that the Yemenis were having, and obviously they're not getting, not every operation is going to be successful. They're not going to stop every ship that goes through and those sort of things, but clearly it's having enough of an impact that it's causing the bankruptcy of a port city, and there's definitely been clear impacts on the Israeli economy of the war in total, and that's certainly a significant factor in it. And I think it has a much broader impact even on Europe and the United States economically too, that is not being discussed a lot, because it's easy for people to blame other factors or just kind of ignore that as a key economic factor. But I think from a military standpoint, they were interested enough that they were trying to get this this former Navy admiral or whatever out to talk about it. So anyway, um, let me see. So let's talk about, there's another picture I want to bring up actually, which is a tweet that you made recently that I wanted to share to start this discussion, because I do want to talk about American politics in relation to everything a little bit right now, which we started to do a little earlier. But so talk about this term that you're talking about here and its different connotations. And I mean, I think for me, obviously watching Netanyahu, I didn't watch the speech, I couldn't bring myself to do that. But the speech that he gave on Congress, with obviously you see all the standing ovations and the clappings and the idiocy from the US Congress, with very minimal, I mean, Rashida Tlaib with her sign, right, of a war criminal and things like that, really being the only form of dissent that you see within that room at all. Um, and obviously there were protests, there was, I don't want to make it seem as if this went off without any dissent or response from people, everyday people. But it certainly was a display in line, as Louis Alday and others have pointed out, with the history of U.S. Congress and the war criminals that we celebrate within our own society, which include all of our presidents and Biden, not least among them. But it was, I think, quite stark to see amid a genocide and as this is going on, a daily bombing of schools and safe zones and things like that that's going on in Gaza, and to see such a kind of display of you know I don't know, acquiesce. I can't think of the correct words, but say a little bit about your read or your feelings on that, and then we can get in a little bit more to discussion of the Harris Biden Trump thing, which I want to talk about a little bit more as well.
Look. For us Palestinians, there's nothing really surprising about Netanyahu going to the U.S. And I think he loves these trips. Netanyahu, you see him like a little kid. It's like I know America. I'm back home. I can play America, and he's coming back. He writes this speech that sounds like bites, only sound bites, and it says things about civilization and barbarians, and hits some points, and then you see these mostly non-aware and ideological congressmen and women clapping in an idiotic way. And many in the Arab world have, compared what was happening in Congress to what happened in a lot of these also symbolic form of, parliaments that a lot of authoritarian regime have, where the leader comes and everybody has to clap and stand and, ensure their adulation for what the leader says, no matter what he says or how absurd he comes across. But it was different, like Netanyahu came. I know that people have I'm not saying we're not going to assess congressmen on the basis of radical politics, but Netanyahu came, and I think that the idea that VP Harris was in there, and she was busy. I know that this is just symbolic and not important in of itself, but this attempt to distance yourself from this Israeli leader that is coming is important. I think 112 congressmen didn't attend. Some also attended, didn't clap. So there was still this kind of fissure that exists, or this attempt at a symbolic distance from Netanyahu, which is the first time we saw that in American history. We didn't see that before. That Netanyahu, when he arrived, even before, even during his shunning of Obama, most of the congressmen, everybody was there. They were clapping, even though the Democratic president at that time saw Netanyahu's speech in Congress as an affront to him and his policy on Iran. So I think that in many instances, or in this case, that we see slowly the impact of what public opinion in the U.S. and its shifts having somewhat on a lot of the elected representatives and their attempt to maintain a pro-Israel policy, but also attempt to distance themselves from Netanyahu and his government. And I know that it's morely concentrated around this kind of figure of Netanyahu, that he's the problem, the right-wing government is the problem, but Israel is redeemable and it's a beautiful country and we should back it. And it has that sensibility to it among most Democrats, and it still will give Israel all the weaponries to kill Palestinians and Arabs. But I think that that's important in of itself to actually witness and see how it plays out, as Israel loses, or as Zionism loses its hegemony over the minds and the hearts of minds of the American people. And I think that that's one of also the consequences of October 7th, that, a lot of people are coming out with a different outlook and understanding and perception of what's happening in Palestine. And I think that's important as well. in the long term, especially for a new generation that I think has been politicized by Palestine. Not only, have come to know Palestine, but have come political through the issue of Palestine. I think a lot of what has been unfolding is irreversible. So my impression is that this is one of the speeches that an Israeli prime minister will give, but maybe it will be one of the last speeches that an Israeli prime minister will give with this form of consensus. Now, what I said in my tweet, that a lot of these congressmen look like a sahij. In Arabic, a sahij is somebody. I mean, it's used. There are different terms in different areas dialectically in the Levant region, if you want. But a sahij is a person who riles up the party, and dabke has a role of riling up the people who do dabke. Dabke is a form of traditional Palestinian dance, a folkloric dance. But a sahij is also used as a derogatory political term for people who, for instance, support Mahmoud Abbas no matter what he does or doesn't do. That cannot think for themselves, that don't have an independent form of a thinking process or whatever, and that will not simply clap. And Sahij also claps, and he only claps at anything and everything that a figure of power says without thinking of it. And I think the Congress looked like that. I think the Congress looked like that for a lot of people in the world, and not only Palestinians. I think that's part of also the burden of Israel that you've been mentioning, that nobody wants to talk about. Not only the economic cost of shipping, not only the strategic burden of backing Israel in terms of in weaponry and money and finances, resources spent on a foreign country that could be spent elsewhere. Not only in terms of what are you getting in terms of strategic returns for the for having Israel. I mean, that's from just a realist point of view. I mean, I know that there's a lot of disagreements on that, and people look at Israel as this kind of it has a different position, whether you're looking from a world systems theory perspective, whether you're looking from Zionist or Israel lobby perspective, or where you're looking from different areas. But I think for me, I mean, looking at Israel now, that it's coming across more of a burden than an asset, at least in many ways. But also, I mean, in terms of soft power in the world, from an American, imperial perspective, I mean, the people are looking at America and seeing it hosting a war criminal, being called by the ICC for committing war crimes. And for regular people across the world, they just don't understand, why would America receive a war criminal with such embrace, love, and support, and with this kind of idiotic, clapping that was taking place throughout his speech. So, in many ways, I think that it does not help its own position, moral standing, political standing, etc., and eroding of that. So, I think the Republicans were happy that the Democrats were, divided. That is creating problems, and that's partially why they called on Netanyahu to come, because within their own party there's more consensus around Israel, more support, blind support for Israel, no matter what it does, for a lot of reasons, culturally, politically, etc. But I think, and they were happy to put the Democrats in this kind of tense position. But again, I think that in many ways, I think maybe will be one of the last speeches of an Israeli prime minister embraced to the extent that Netanyahu was embraced in this speech. I think what we'll see slowly but assuredly is the loss of significant soft power, a more costly, or that Israel policy will become more costly for the American politician and policymaker. I know that that's not still the case in a very obvious way, but I think slowly and assuredly that's the trend, and that's where it's going, in terms of generations, in terms of what been happening in the United States across the past 10 months, North America more broadly, and also Europe and elsewhere.
I hope that you're right. I'll put it that way. The so I'm gonna ask one more, and then I have a couple from the audience, and I can, if folks have other ones, I can open up to that. Um, but I just want to go back to this discussion again of the different. So just to walk through sequence of events, I'm sure everybody knows this, but like, you have the poor debate performance, right? This extremely quick media, uh, I would call it a kind of media ruling class coup, right? Where they say, okay, we have to get Biden out of here. We have to find another option. I've shared before with folks, I think that you can't look at that in isolation as about the debate performance. That's one factor. I think another factor for Biden was certainly that he's so tied to this genocide right now. He is so tied to Israel, and um, they knew that it was already an issue in terms of increasing the number of people willing to produce or to support third party candidates, even though that might be small for any individual candidate. I saw reports that in some states it was as high as, double digits of the electorate that were willing to vote for third party candidates. You also had, the uncommitted campaign, right? So there's a lot of people who had expressed that they weren't willing to vote for Biden, or that they were going to look at another option, and I think so that I think was a factor. I think the debate performance was a factor. Um, so then, we have the Trump situation where, there's the assassination attempt, of course, which is a very strange moment. And then that momentarily kind of stops some of that talk, but very quickly it picks back up again. And within a week, I think, from that, you end up with, um, you said it could be Kamala, it could be somebody else, but Kamala Harris she now has swept up the delegates that she needs. So even though the convention is still forthcoming, it's really a formality at this point. She's going to be the Democratic candidate for president, um, and I've talked about this a little bit in the discussion I had on counterinsurgency and elections this past week, but Kamala Harris is an interesting, but I think she's more sophisticated as, I think, a counterinsurgent kind of figure for the Democratic Party in this moment than Joe Biden was capable of being, right? And so um the the question of whether she's more moved by, you know, pro-Palestinian voices or younger folks. She's clearly been very committed to Israel throughout her political career. I think that she wants to present that way, that she's more that she cares a lot about the civilians, and then still talk about Israelis' right to defend itself, and it being an ally and all of those kind of things. And so it's really the same message that Joe Biden has been delivering, but it's in a packaging that she would hope would appeal to more people and would be more believable. And because she's not the one literally handing over the weapons, but second in command as the weapons are being handed over, she has some distance. I think it's interesting the point you raised earlier, though, because you talked about the potential for a ceasefire within the next month, which I hadn't really thought of it that way. Like, part of the way that I had thought about it is, Netanyahu might come, he might see, oh, we've got a situation where there's nobody really at the wheel right now. It's on autopilot. The president that's in the presidency will be making the decisions for the next 6 months, but has no consequences for decisions that he makes. And after that, it's likely that we get Trump. Maybe we get Harris, and I have to, but it gives a kind of 6-month window at least for Netanyahu potentially to say, I can do whatever I want within this time frame. That's one way to read it, right? But I think the next month is interesting because I think in order for Harris to be able to keep up um, that I would say a ploy, but whether people believe she's being legitimate or not, that positioning that she cares about Palestinians or whatever, there has to be something tangible maybe to go with that, to be able to I think the best case for scenario for Harris is that it's out of the picture as a discussion item, right? Is that she can say, okay, we have a peace agreement, we have a ceasefire. Um, and then she doesn't have to worry so much about losing Zionists support. She doesn't have to worry about appealing very much to the pro-Palestinian voices, right? So I think that's an interesting way to think about it within American politics. It's an optimistic, from I think from the perspective of at least the lessening of the carnage. I mean, I think that, the Lancet article that estimates, closer to 200,000 people killed in Gaza, and the discussions of like things like polio and, other things starting to rise from, as you were talking about earlier, all of the decay of the, social civilian infrastructure due to the genocide. So yeah, I don't know. But I don't know if you have any response to what I've laid out there.
Well, yeah. I mean, the U.S. is going through its turbulence, as you were saying. But remember, like, I mean, Biden is still president, and 6 months is a long time. And Biden can and use leverage if he wants to, in multiple directions. Again, vis-a-vis the Israeli government, whether it's through weapons or finances or otherwise. And because he's now not running again, he has also less concern about electoral politics and the circle around him, less concern about electoral politics, and will look at this from a strategic perspective, maybe perhaps from an ideological perspective as well, in terms of backing Israel and the need to back Israel. And then we'll look at it for what policy would serve Kamala Harris. So on the one hand, because Biden is not running, that gives the Democratic Party more of a leeway to allow the war to perhaps continue. But as I'm reminded a lot in the history of American presidency and presidents that a lot of them, when they became lame duck and were about to end their end their term as president, they choose to engage in maybe I can get peace done, maybe I can have some sort of one last effort at a historic accomplishment that I can savor and place as part of my legacy. And I think as Biden looks at his legacy, and specifically at what he can achieve in terms of foreign policy, I think the idea of Middle East, a ceasefire in the Middle East, some prospect for a two-state solution that is not necessarily a real prospect, and of course, getting Saudi-Israeli normalization would be some sort of feat that he would want to accomplish. It doesn't mean that he will accomplish, but it means that he will be pushing for that direction, at least in terms of his administration policy, but also because of American interests, underlying interests of not allowing this war to reach a level where it becomes regional, of maintaining some sort of stability in the region overall, keeping the prices of oil, low, and not risking. If Bab el-Mandeb caused some economic problems for Israel, I mean, if you close Bab el-Mandeb and you close the Strait of Hormuz, which is across from between Iran and the Emirates, that creates a global financial crisis as well. So, American, policy is also driven by a lot of strategic considerations, that are important and necessary for its economic recovery, for the ensuring that inflationary pressure remains under control, for a lot of the things that also would, be perhaps a nuclear doomsday scenario for the global economy overall. So I think for in many ways, Jared, I think that Biden will be pushing for a ceasefire, at least on some level. I think that he will be pushing for some sort of accomplishment. Now, at least that's my own take. I mean, people will have a different reading. They will say, no, Biden is a Zionist. He's ideological. He wants to allow Israel. He's just giving them maneuvering space. I'm not sure about that. I think that he wants to push for a ceasefire, whether it's for underlying American interests or whether it's for his own legacy and, coming at the end of his life and the end of his political career, achieving something that has shamed him, and will shame him historically for his role in the Gaza genocide. But at the same time, maybe he will get, some sort of, in his own mind, I mean, a redeeming quality by getting the ceasefire done. So that's one element for it. I think Netanyahu wants to perhaps wait it out. So that's where I'm not sure. I mean, I think, again, I'm saying that at the beginning I said Netanyahu has maneuverability space now with his own coalition partners. It doesn't mean that he will use it. It might mean that he will keep pushing. But I think the accumulation of frustration within Israel, the accumulation of the pressure from within the military and security network within Israel, the ones running the military and the army and the security brass, more broadly, the Shabak, the Mossad, etc., that are pushing for a deal, combined with an American, will for a deal, combined with, a regional also need for such a deal. I think that, Netanyahu will, with his maneuverability space, will probably go for a deal. Now, having said that, that also might not be the case. It might come after an escalation with Lebanon, some show of force, some heating up of different areas before it slowly erodes. But that's my reading. I mean, and I do agree. I mean, I think that, I think other readings are also legitimate. I mean, that, Netanyahu doesn't want it. We're going for a war. It's going for escalation. I think that there's, enough evidence to also support, the other line of argument that would look at Israeli policy as one that will keep pushing and pushing for either, again, a continuous war effort in the Gaza Strip, accepting an attritional warfare position and the strategic bind it finds itself, and looking forward towards the erosion of the will of Palestinian people to stand steadfast, destroying as much as possible of Gaza for what remains of Gaza, and at the same time coming out with a better agreement in the future and maintaining the political survival of Netanyahu himself. So there is that argument that, is also important and profound. Now, I think it's a ploy, Jared, but what you said about Harris, that, this rhetorical distance, but I think it's important to note that why do you need a ploy? You need a ploy because at the end of the day, that there is pressure on the political class now in the United States, emanating not just from ending the war, but emanating from, this increasing base of support. And I don't mean now, the most radical components of the Palestinian movement, but I mean a more broad-based support for the conditions and the struggles of the Palestinian people, and more awareness of what happened to Palestine historically, more awareness of how the struggle unfolded throughout the past century or so, and more awareness of the moral and political hypocrisy of the institution and governments that the United States and Europe and their role in the creation of the Palestinian problem in the first place. So I think that we will not see the impact of this immediately, but I think as slow as it might seem, as unsatisfying it might look, because when you're more immersed in this, you're looking at these type of processes as they have to be fast. Why isn't everybody outraged and on the street? And of course, there's still an ideological struggle, and there's still a lot of power for the Zionist lobby, for the Christian Zionists who are still fervently supporters of Israel, for the right left divide in the U.S., whatever that means, and all of these accumulating factors that have place. But I think that there is a shift. There is more cognizance among the American democratic political class that they cannot sustain their position, this outright position, rhetorical or otherwise, of Israel, with a base that is growing skeptical, wary, and more cynical towards Israel and what it represents and what it embodies in terms of moral values, in terms of its status and posture, and in terms of what it has been committing against the Palestinian people. And that type of dissonance within a political party cannot be sustained for a long time, you'll start to see more and more fractures within the Democratic Party around this issue, and more perhaps voices that are more clearly pro-Palestinian. And I know that, I forgot his name, the congressman that lost, or the senator,
Jamal Bowman.
Jamal Bowman lost the elections, but they had to spend, I think, around $16 million or more on defeating him, and create a wide political machinery to ensure that this kind of nuanced political position of Bowman will not actually make way within the Democratic Party. And I do think that actually Bowman's position will become slowly but steadily the position within a lot of the congressmen within the Democratic Party, as elections shift and take, because they will understand that a large part of the base has concretely shifted its own outlook and position, and also takes an issue of Palestine as a moral and ethical barometer for what this person represents, not only as an issue that is of minor concern, but your stance on Palestine tells us something about you, about your moral character, about your ethical character, about how you see the world and view it. And I think that will slowly and steadily become the case within the Democratic Party as we move, as the new generation also has more role to play within it as well. But again, I know I'm taking away from your counterinsurgent reading of election. I know that.
No, you're fine. I mean, my thought as you finished that was, I hope that the Democratic Party isn't around that much longer. But
yeah, I mean, that's a different thing. I mean, look, I mean, I try to not interfere in your internal politics, so that's up to you guys, what you do. I mean, I'm not here trying to agitate. I'm just reading the political map. I mean, if a revolution happens in America, that's a different issue. Then we'll have a different conversation for sure.
I wish I had a more optimistic feeling on that right now. I've probably never been more depressed about the potential for that than in the last few months. But I maintain my optimism. So anyway, yeah, don't worry, we'll have more opportunities to talk about Kamala Harris and counterinsurgency on this platform, so you can present the optimistic Palestinian.
No, I'm looking at it from a neuro perspective, like, because what you speak to is a different thing. You're speaking about the potential for a radical movement within the United States that changes the grounds of how politics operates. Now, I'm still thinking through the way politics operates now.
What I'm saying is that. Yeah, what I'm saying is that the Democratic Party's history, right, is one of trying to placate, symbolically reference it to self to, and co-opt ultimately more radical, more insurgent politics, and convince them that this is the place where we can pragmatically address those issues. And then it doesn't actually do that, right? It actually then falls back on what are the imperial interests, what are the key the interests of the ruling class, and so on. And I think I don't want to discount at all what you're saying, because what you're saying is that there's been a profound shift in how the American people view this issue as a result of October 7th and as a result of everything that's happened since then, and that shift has created a situation where it's difficult for a Democrat who wants to call themselves progressive, right, to walk a line that is just strictly I'm pro-Israel no matter what, which is basically kind of the Joe Biden position, where they'll say they care about civilian casualties, yet every day they're getting up before the microphone and explaining, like, well, it depends. Like, sometimes you can bomb hospitals. Sometimes it's okay to kill school children. Like, these are the kinds of arguments that they're making on a daily basis, which just don't, nobody with a conscience really can get behind this, And so, yeah, I mean, I think there is something to what you're saying. I just think that it will be very interesting to see. I don't have a, I find it difficult to predict.
No, but I
You
mean,
know,
look, I
yeah,
don't think also, Jared, that we're waiting a change in America that liberates us. I mean, that's not also how I think of this. No, but I think that when you're what is important from a Palestinian perspective is that you end the consensus around Israel, not necessarily that and you end this kind of Zionist hegemony over American even popular culture that existed for a long time. Like, and I think that that's been that's relatively have been to some degree accomplished. Now, I might have come across more optimistic than most people, and I understand that because it reminds me of it reminds me of this position in Palestine generally, is that generally people are always saying we need things to change now. Like at this particular moment, everything has to completely burst out in the open, and then you have this kind of radical configuration. I mean, I take or reconfiguration and radical change. I take a different view. I think that also historic changes take a long time to fester. I mean, even when people ask me why the West Bank didn't, why there's no Intifada, why part of the reason, of course, we talked about this a lot, but part of the reason is that it doesn't always happen in the moment that you think everything should just completely blow up and shatter in different directions. That these processes take time, that a change in cognition or in the consciousness of people, the way they look at Palestine through an ethical and moral prism, the way they will assess their own politicians based on that kind of ethical, that's an important element to a political struggle and to a Palestine movement that will have to think across different lanes, across organizing, across what it means, for instance, how Americans think, or how the world or people in the world are thinking about what type of world we want to live in, what type of economic changes and political changes we want to see in the systems that govern us. Do we want even like this kind of governance system or some other model? These are all important questions, but as the Palestine movement thinks of also what potential exists, in terms of how you push for your own your own version of policies, and I'm here not advocating for a Palestine lobby in this sense, but what I'm trying to say is that this has a potential to energize, Palestine has a potential to energize local political issues, but also has a potential to create this kind of filtering lens through which you look at all your own progressive politicians and political actors and see to what extent they're willing to be pragmatic with the powers they be when you elect them. And I think, or even if you don't want to engage in elections as such, how they think of their role in the system. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism launched at what's her name, AOC, for her type of pragmatic and version of politics, and she's being placed in this kind of untenable position across being progressive, but at the same time maintaining support for Biden, but at the same time keeping a distance from Israel, but not really attacking it, and at the same time keeping distance. So she's trying as much as possible to play these varying games and maneuvers around this issue, but at the same time she's getting a lot of heat for it. And I think that people can see through that, and this is where you see where politicians are the most uncomfortable, and where you can still push their uncomfort to its limits and to its extent. And at the same time, I think for me, if I was American, I mean, yeah, it will serve as an issue where I think, do I vote for that? Not because of Palestinians, because it won't change anything. Even if you have 30 congressmen who are like more vocal about Palestine, it will not change, anything for us. I mean, I'm not, here, any, it will not, change the world for Palestinians, in any significant way. But what it means for you, I mean, in terms of, is this person a coherent, consistent, moral, ethical and political actor. What it means in terms of his own view of the world and position, whether he has an imperialist tendency, whether he's willing to make sit comfortable. Again, I destroyed my mic. Whether he's willing to sit comfortably with, with the American imperial machine, whether he's not, I don't know. I mean, these are all, I think, questions that I think through Palestine, I think it also helps whatever radical or progressive movements that associate with themselves with elections. And I can understand your position, which is a bit more anti-elections and anti-engagement with like the political system itself, and wants to work from the outside. And perhaps if I was, with you now in Philly, I would be more inclined towards your politics.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's nothing. I don't claim anything special about my view other than it's mine. But the point you made about Jamal Bowman and AOC, I think, is relevant to the discussion. Lara Kilani brought up this a little bit earlier in saying it's part of what you're describing. I think she was talking about, I was describing in terms of democratic counterinsurgency. And I think, and she makes the point that then the 2 points are not necessarily contradictory, which I actually agree with, which is that, as I understand what Lara is saying there, they are engaging in these modes. So just to give people a little bit of background on Bowman, initially he was very pro-Zionist and actually got a lot of heat for this, and it caused its own fissures within the DSA for endorsing him and supporting him. And then I don't know who brought him to Palestine, but he was a part of a delegation then that came out of that. And he used that as his aha moment of, oh, I've seen the checkpoints, I've seen this and that, like I'm opposed to apartheid, right? And so took a little bit of a stronger position, right, in terms of, not being, I'm thinking with Lara's language too, not anti-Zionist, I would say, right? Not in any kind of principled sense, right? But like kind of trying to thread this needle of, criticism of Israel and certain policies that Israel engages in, right? Kind of similar to what Bernie Sanders does in some ways, but maybe a little bit more committed to it, right? And so you can see that trajectory, right, of like him being a progressive and moving his position a little bit and that changing. And I think that's true, and I think that was also one of the reasons why he got defeated on some level, was because people also knew that this trajectory wasn't totally authentic and legitimate, and that he was kind of doing what he thought was best, for his own political career and his viability, rather than being like really morally, ethically committed on the issue, right? And I think that's the same problem that a lot of these, we call them the squad, but these people in Congress who call themselves progressive, right? Cori Bush is another one that's facing a huge campaign to try to get her out, who comes out of, Ferguson and, all of that. And so, yeah, it will be interesting, I think, to watch those things. But I'm with you in what you said, is like, from my perspective, it's like, what's the most you could get out of that form of politics? Yeah, it might be like 30 people who do that kind of wishy-washy shit in Congress. And like, I don't know that, how meaningful that project really is. And so, yeah, that's my, I worry about the amount of time, energy, and investment people put into organizing in that way for what I see as like fairly limited returns on a kind of material level, if any. And so that's the challenge, but people disagree with me on that. So, and that's fine. All right. I'm going to take a question from the audience here. So it seems like a lot has been happening in the West Bank. How significant is what happened this week with Tulkarm's Tabet hospital? And
Thabit.
then Tabet, I'm sorry.
It's not Tabit. It's like Thabit.
Thabet. Okay. Thank you. Then this is connected, I think, when the mothers of martyrs and residents intervened in the PA siege on the wounded fighter, as in, is it a reflection of growing tension within the contradiction between the PA and the resistance in the West Bank? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's an important aside to investigate the relationship between the PA and the resistance, but also I think it's one of the operative theories of the resistance that exists in the north of the West Bank, not necessarily in a very conscious way when I say theories, which is that the existence of these armed groups that have been developing, it creates the basis for a perhaps at sometimes in some contexts, like what happened in this hospital, which was named actually Thabit. Thabit is a doctor who was assassinated by Israel in the Second Intifada, and he was a leader in Fatah, just for people's knowledge, and one of the key activists in the Tul Karim area in that moment as well. But what what it does is that the more resistance can entrench itself, maintain itself, create tactical economy of exchange with Israel, ensure that it has a wider support among various strata of society, specifically coming from the working classes, and also perhaps enabling itself to also entrench itself within even the middle classes in these areas and draw support. The more that these confrontation, where the PA comes and tries to arrest, or could actually go from a minor confrontation to more perhaps wider revolt against the PA and its policies and presence in these areas. I don't think that we're still in that moment, but I think that that's the flash that happened. The PA security forces came to arrest Abu Shuja', who's one of the leaders of the resistance in Tul Karim. And then you had the people in the hospital and across the hospital galvanizing and mobilizing to release him from PA's attempt at this arrest operation. But it also shows the pragmatism of the PA. The PA didn't decide to push on. It just withdrew from the area under the force of this popular mobilization that existed at that moment. And the PA is pragmatic in this sense when it senses that this could lead to a wider revolt or configuration, or people actually starting to confront it in a more violent way. It withdrew, and it allowed the arrest operation to not continue. And I think it attests to also one element that a lot of Palestinians underestimate about PA pragmatism in terms of managing dissent also within our society. It does it in a way that allows it and permits it to also continue without a lot of resistance directed against it. And that's how they do it. It's they repress, they arrest, but at the same time they maintain support base. They're pragmatic in terms of the tactics. Sometimes they exceed themselves, but they withdraw immediately. They might arrest somebody, and then if they see a lot of outcry, actually release him. These are the type of maneuvering that the PA does quite well, and that helped it at least maintain some sort of I wouldn't say acceptability or legitimacy, but at least that people are unwilling to confront it direct on, because also there's a lot of consequences and cost to doing so economically and politically, and in terms of internal social cohesion within Palestinian society itself. So I think that's an important flashpoint. It's an important as a microscope to how resistance, even though it's armed, can actually hinge on a wider popular base, but also on how that wider popular base could come to the rescue of resistance, and at the same time how the armed movement pushes the people towards a more active political stance vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority or Israel itself. So we can see that all condensed in that moment, alongside the pragmatism of the PA, and also its outright cooperation with Israel by attempting to arrest one of the most popular figures in the resistance movement in the Tulkarem area as well. So I mean, it's that, you know, all of these contradictions and perhaps are encapsulated in that scene in the hospital in Tulkarem 2 days ago.
Yeah, thank you. Lana, thank you for the support. Appreciated. Juju, appreciated the comment. My mom works in shipping logistics for a fruit export company. The Yemeni blockade has had a significant impact on the industry. All right, so this is the last question we have from the audience, unless other people add in other ones, but it's a good one for us to wrap on, which is just your opinion about the future. Are you hopeful? Do you see the future of Palestine, free Palestine from the river to the sea, or a greater Israel, Eretz Israel from the river to the sea?
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, of course, my own desire and whims and, you know, wishful thinking is, you know, is more on, of course, Palestine being free. However, I think that that's to the extent, you know, the very nature of the struggle at this current moment. First of all, we do have a greater Israel at this current moment. I mean, Israel does control the entire area between the river and the sea. It's the only really significant sovereign power outside of the Palestinian resistance, wherever it exists, that is attempting to at least erode that sovereignty. I see the future more hopeful than I used to perhaps in the past. But at the same time, having said so, I don't think that hope or hope is necessarily, you know, the currency that we should, you know, rely on most. I mean, the thing about any war, any form of struggle, it's a matter of will, capacities, ability to materialize, accumulate power, all forms of power, and that, you know, there are signs within Palestinians, among Palestinians. I mean, this is one of the ironies of the current moment, is that the most excited, the contingency of Palestinians most excited for what happened on October 7th afterwards are actually in the diaspora, not within Palestine itself. And there's a reason for that. I'll explain, you know, that contradiction. I think that October 7th, as much as is, you know, represented this moment of exhilaration, of the opening of the flood, you know, the gates around Gaza, an operation that was, you know, devised in a way to break, you know, the iron wall of Israel's military, and was successful in many ways on multi levels. It also was a moment full of anxiety for a lot of people within Palestine, not only because of Israel's ability to create inhalative strategies, as we saw since then, meaning the destruction and killing and the catastrophe it can actually inflict, but also because liberation itself is a very anxiety-ridden issue, if you want. I mean, people were also afraid of what it means if we, you know, Palestine can actually be liberated. I mean, you know, there are many elements to that. Some of it is funny, but some of it is also tragic. You know, people have made choices. You know, I don't know, a girl from Nazareth decided to leave the love of her life, who lives in, I don't know, Ramallah, because of the difference in ID cards between her having Israeli citizenship and him having a green ID card, being a subject of the West Bank, which means people have, throughout this history, on the everyday level, through the existing order that they live in, have made choices, have made arrangements, have, you know, have an everyday life that liberation also could, in essence, disrupt. And despite the fact Palestinians yearn for liberation, that anxiety from liberation also coexists with it. So in many ways, what we've seen since October 7th is also Palestinians, you know, being driven in different contradictory, or being subjected to different contradictory winds. on a psychological level, on a political level, on an economic level, and on the level of also, pure fear and terror from this regime of terror that we live in. So, unlike what a lot of people say, Palestinians have things to lose. And, especially if you're living within the river and the sea, and they have a lot to lose. I mean, people and family and homes and jobs and plans and dreams, and even within Gaza, which is the most, let's say, abject place that was outside the geography of immediate control of Israel, but remained also under siege, etc. So I think the picture is complicated. I don't think it's a simple answer, meaning that I think that what I'm witnessing among Palestinians is like these two conflicting streams coming together. One is this kind of hope that emanates from this moment where Israel's, arrogance and feeling of invincibility, viewing them imploding on some level. I wouldn't say imploding in a very, dramatic way, but imploding on some level socially, their internal, circles of trust, their increasing disunity. We've seen a lot of signs of also the erosion of Zionism and its hold and power over the Jewish community, but also in the world, but also over its own legitimacy and standing in the world. There's a lot of hopeful signs. I mean, Ilan Pape wrote a great article, stating why he thinks that this is a moment, that is seeing the end of Zionism and its sovereignty over Palestine, and he identifies a lot of, I think, important trends that are happening from a very Israeli-centric, let's say, point of view of why Palestine will be liberated, mostly because Ilan Pape says it has things to do with the dynamics of implosion that also October 7th perhaps accelerated. So there is hope there. But I think that on the other side, there's, I think I'm also kind of weary of, giving people like this is inevitable or this is going to happen anyways, I think this is a struggle of wills. And I from the beginning, I said that October 7th both brings forth the nightmare and the dream. And in many ways, what I didn't think of at that moment was that the nightmare not necessarily is maybe also sometimes a dream itself. I mean, in a sense that, I'm trying to be here, I don't know, free with words. So forgive me, but what I mean exactly is that, that people are afraid of liberation. I mean, the other day I was talking to somebody and he was saying, but what program we will have after liberation, what will, what political arrangement, so there's a lot of people throwing in a lot of fears, whether it's, a Palestinian, perhaps Christian, thinking if Hamas comes in and you have an Islamic regime, what would that mean to me? Or a Palestinian inside 1948 thinking, will I lose, the healthcare system that Israel, gave me access to? Or, some choice that I made in my history that has to do with this kind of, the pressure that politics has on me? Or will my degree count in a future, liberated Palestine? Like people are making jokes about it, which tells me that they felt that that was a real moment in the breakdown of Israel's regime, which actually shows that October 7th was a significant thing on the level of the psyche, on the level of how people perceive themselves in the world, etc. But it didn't only lead to, excitement and overwhelming support for resistance. Of course, people support resistance, but at the same time, in that very support, they have, all these fears coming. And, people are placing a lot of pressure on what a resistant action or operation should also hold. It should tell us what form of, world we will live in a post-colonial or a decolonized situation. So I think that that's one of the problems of this moment, is that it's conflicting. It's takes you in different directions, and like a ship that is being struck by different winds, sometimes it leads to this form of stasis rather than a form of, and I think the Israelis are using that in the West Bank, using that by expanding settlements. They're using that by, showing this kind of will, specifically among the right-wing fascist elements and the organized elements, to through their war of taking over certain key parts of the Israeli military bureaucracy in the West Bank, or by ensuring that they entrench more settlements, create more outposts, legalize, divert more finances, to ensure that they have a hold over the area between the river, the sea. So at this point, you have a conflicting map of what's happening. You have, on the one sense, an erosion in the power of Israel, an erosion in the perception of how people view Israel and its legitimacy in the world, but also in their world in terms of how they view Israel's invincibility and power, and a real opening of the potential of liberation that people saw on October 7th, that is both scary and at the same time exhilarating. And I think that is all, taking place, and it's leading to, Palestinians, inability to think the moment, not only to think it. I mean, that's one of the, major issues. I mean, I'm a quite avid reader of a lot of people who speak about this moment, and beyond the political analysis that we've been talking about, and there's a lot of political analysis in the Arab world, but I think that in many ways, there's very lack of a deep understanding of what this moment really means and how to actually meet its challenge and what it raises in terms of the questions, whether it's among intellectuals or, normal people, or I wouldn't say normal people, but, any person, or even among academics or etc. So I think that, in many ways, that's a problem. It's a very conflicting, highly energizing, and highly at the same demobilizing moment. So it's strange. So it gives me, there is hope on a more historical processes level. If you want to look at it, there's a lot of trends that you can say are going Palestine's way. And at the same time, at the end of the day, and that's what I know, is that the way the Zionist movement looks at it, if the Palestinians are defeated, then it doesn't matter if these historical processes are going their way, because if they're willing to submit, if they're willing to recognize Israel, affirm its legitimacy, then it doesn't matter what the International Court of Justice says, and it doesn't matter what the ICC says. And I think that's what the Zionist movement is also in many ways betting on, is that it will get the Palestinians to submit. And it has, among the Palestinians, enough of models in front of it, whether it's the Palestinian Authority, whether it's a lot of the Arab parties in the Knesset, or a lot of forms of cooperation, to see that, even those we control are willing to submit to our sovereignty, are willing to submit to the legitimacy of the state, are willing to accept their everyday life, and perhaps even invest in it, and sometimes even fight for it. And I think that that's what also the Zionist movement is banking on, that it could defeat and break the Palestinian resistance and create these models of cooperation, whether through indirect forms of control and neocolonialism as exists in the West Bank, or through a much more normalized form of cooperation that people have less confliction about. In some instances, we spoke of, for instance, about the Druze community in Palestine, in the Galilee, who have a more normalized sense of the cooperation with colonialism for a lot of different historical reasons. And of course, I don't want to here generalize, because many among the Druze community refuse to join the military, even on the cost of being imprisoned. A lot of them are Arab and Palestinian nationalists and identify as such. But at the same time, still, the community, through its sectarian sensibility, took that posture. So you have these different forms of cooperation that also empowers this regime to think that if they break the Palestinian people, then, there's nobody to really worry about. What does it matter if the ICC says it's occupation or not? The people who are under occupation don't really care about it. So I think that's the different also historical trend that is problematic. There is, for any for any in the stream, for any Palestinian here as well, there is an increasing Israelization within 1948, for instance. There's more acceptance of the bubbles we live in the West Bank as well, among large swaths of the Palestinians. I mean, we shouldn't overlook this and only provide people a narrative of resistance. And yeah, of course, there is resistance, and there are people who resist, and there is incredible and highly meticulous and highly sacrificial heroics that are engaged in the fight. But at the same time, there are trends that are going in a different direction. They're going towards a politics of Palestinian self-effacement, negation, towards increased, criminal gangs, for instance, in 1948. And I think that in many ways that, that is also part and parcel of the struggle. It's not only in Palestine, I think it's also in the larger Arab world. People are comfortable living in Pax Americana in Dubai, under American protection and within this global economy of petrodollars. I mean, we shouldn't kid ourselves. They might have in their heart support for Palestine, but at the same time, in many ways, they're comfortable through this life. And in Lebanon, at the same time, that's a struggle that exists between different competing political projects. In Jordan, in Egypt, and I mean, it's not only an issue in Palestine itself. I think Palestine is also a microcosm of the larger Arab world and how it views its own standing in history and project. But again, I do think that despite having said so, the existence of this kind of intricate alliance system, the increasing dialectical lessons learned by the resistance forces throughout this history of confrontation, the weakness of Israel as a neoliberal economy that cannot really sacrifice in the heat of battle, cannot place its son of daughters in vulnerability and fragility, that harkens towards this kind of technological dominance as a means to maintain its presence and dominance in the Middle East. The changing dynamics of legitimacy in the globe, the lawfare and the legal warfare, the talk about elections in the US, that we talked about. So these shifting terrains, these historical processes are also going our way, and that's what makes me hopeful. And what makes me hopeful, of course, that as long as Palestinians are asking for their rights and at the same time demanding them and at the same time fighting for them, there's always going to be the possibility that the dream of liberation becomes a reality.
Perfect. Right. I think we should. What's that?
I took a long time for that, but yeah.
No. That was good. Yeah, I do have to wrap up, so I think we'll wrap it up there, and that's a good place to leave it. There was another question that came up, but we'll get to it next time. We'll always have more of these conversations. And one thing I did want to say to folks is I don't know how many of you are in the Philadelphia area, South Jersey, North Delaware, etc. But Stephen Salida will be in conversation with Susan Abu Hawa, and that's at Making Worlds Bookstore and Social Center in Philadelphia later today. I'll be there. So anyways, there's a few spaces left. It's pretty much sold out, but there's a few spaces left if people want to go. I don't think it'll be live streamed, Lara. We might try, but I don't think so, unfortunately. But anyway, good to be in conversation with you again. We will do it again. This is the 11th conversation, as I said, that we'll add to the Conversations with Abdaljawad playlist. So yeah, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Jared, for having me.
Always welcome.